I don't know about you guys, but sometimes it can be a little overwhelming with how many handhelds there are out there. A lot of us in this hobby have multiple handhelds, and that leaves us with a couple different problems. You just don't know what to bring sometimes. Should I take my ROG Ally X and get some AAA PC gaming on the go? Should I bring my Odin 2 and play some classics from my childhood? Regardless of which device you bring with you, sometimes it's fun to bring a controller. Now, a lot of these devices are pretty big, so it makes it difficult to carry them around. If you're taking a big device like the ROG Ally X or maybe your Switch, sometimes it's hard to throw a full-size controller in your bag. That's where mini controllers come in. While not being an entirely perfect controller, the SN30 Pro from 8BitDo is actually a pretty decent little controller. It has some full-size joysticks on it. One thing this controller is lacking is any form of ergonomics. It's pretty small and it doesn't really have anything on the back to grip onto. So I want to know if there is a good alternative to the SN30 Pro. Well, today we're going to look at something a little different. I want to test it on a couple of these handhelds to see how well it works. This is the Mantis controller from a company called Retro Fighters. You've probably heard of them before. They've gone back and remade a lot of classic controllers. Today, we're going to take a look at the Mantis controller to see if this is a good controller for taking with you on the go. This controller is designed for PlayStation 4 and PC, but I want to know if it's compatible with other devices. Is this any good and is it worth picking up? I don't know, but let's find out. Just a disclaimer before we start, this controller was sent to me by the company. They're not seeing this review beforehand, they have no input in what I say, and of course, I'm just going to give you guys my honest thoughts to what I think about this. So what is exactly the Mantis controller? Let's hop onto their website and take a closer look. Right off the bat, this is available on their website for $39 US. Comes in a couple different colors. You get that classic retro gray. I like this one better than the transparent one. I think this looks really cool. And of course, we have the transparent crystal version. This is the one that I have on hand here. This controller is a Bluetooth controller, so it should be compatible with more than the PlayStation 4 and the PC. And it also has Hall effect joysticks. This means that you're not likely to get drift with this anytime soon. The other standout features from this controller in particular, aside from the size, is it does have some LEDs on it, which is pretty nice. It supports gyro, has a built-in speaker, and a touchpad on it. It also has variable trigger stops, which is really unique, especially for a mini controller. There's also some programmable back buttons. This controller does support X input and D input modes. Let's hop right in though. I'm curious to see how this controller fares and if it's any good. So let's get to the unboxing. The box is pretty nice and it shows us some of the specifications on the back. It was shipped in a really good box and I had no issues with damaged packaging. Now that I've got the plastic off, let's open it up. Inside the box, we have a USB-A to USB-C cable. It's about 2.5 to 3 feet long. We have, of course, the controller itself. This is actually really nice. The only other thing we have in the box is a quick start guide with some warranty information. So first impressions of the controller, it's pretty good. It's a lot lighter than I thought it would be. It's not a bad thing though. It makes it definitely a lot easier to carry around. It feels pretty solid. The controller's actually a lot thinner than I thought it would be too. Up by the triggers, this measures 32 millimeters. At the bottom is 33.4 millimeters. The face buttons are a nice size. They have a nice tactile click to them. They're definitely rubber membrane. I like face buttons around 10 millimeters. These ones come in at 9.5. The plastic is a pretty good build quality. It's kind of a smooth plastic, but it does feel really solid. There's some pretty clicky triggers and some nice soft bumpers. Taking a look at the controller itself, we have the D-pad over here on the left. This does feel like a very retro-like D-pad. We got the share button and the options button, or if you're using this on PC, this will be start and select. There's a home button at the bottom. We have two full-size joysticks down here. These feel very similar to PlayStation joysticks. There's some glossy face buttons. Zooming in a little bit more so you can see it. They look pretty cool, don't they? I really like the design on them. There's also a small speaker in the center, and you have the touchpad on top. On the top of the controller, you have the two bumpers and the two triggers. We also have the power button to turn it on, and a pairing button with the USB-C port. On the back of the controller, we have some trigger stops on the back of the inside grip. These let the triggers stop much quicker. This would be really good for a first-person shooter. If you wanted to play a racing game, you could flip that over and you get your full analog triggers. These feel much smoother as well. It sounds much softer when it's set to the full analog trigger mode. Those two programmable buttons sit on the inside and the bottom. They're really nice and they don't feel too loose. We also have the mode switch on the bottom. I'm just going to leave this set to X input with most systems. There's also a little bit of texture on the back plastic and it's kind of frosted. All in all, very solid first impressions from the controller. I only have 3 mini controllers on hand. I have the small M30 Bluetooth controller from 8BitDo, the SN30 Pro, and of course the Mantis controller. The Mantis controller is just ever so slightly wider. We have a little bit more height, but not by much. But you do also get those ergonomic grips on the back. I think this is a good controller, but I do like the ergonomics better on this. When you're using the SN30, you don't really have much to grip onto, so you kind of have to grab it like this, and it's not the most comfortable. The M30 Bluetooth is a lot more comfortable because you have rounded sides and a little bit of grip on the back. It's definitely not much, but it is ever so slightly more comfortable than the SN30 Pro. However, with the Mantis controller, we have full grips on this back. This makes this way more comfortable to hold. You have some nice rounded sides and the soft textured plastic. This makes this controller all in all just extremely comfortable to hold on to. So if I had to pick one for ergonomics, I would definitely pick the Mantis. So as mentioned, the buttons on this are rubber membrane. They have a nice tactile feel to them. They're not too loud and there's not really any wiggle to them. There's some dome switch start and select buttons, and the home button is ever so slightly clicky. The top 2 buttons are also dome switch, but they're extremely quiet. The face buttons themselves only stick out ever so slightly from the controller itself. All in all, excellent face buttons. They're very retro-like. These are definitely louder buttons on the SN30 Pro. They stick out about the same, and they are rubber membrane as well, but there's a lot more wiggle to these. They're not bad, but I prefer the face buttons on the Mantis. Next up, let's talk about these joysticks. As mentioned, they do feel like a PlayStation controller joystick. I don't own a PlayStation currently, but I have in the past. These remind me a lot of the PlayStation 4 joysticks. The top is concave, and it's a soft rubber. Gives me a lot of grip while using this, and there's a nice texture around the edge. There's also an anti-friction ring around the joystick, which should prevent a lot of wear over time. It is just made out of plastic, but it does feel very smooth. Even after using this for a little while, I don't see any joystick wear. The joysticks on the SN30 Pro feel very similar, however they don't have an anti-friction ring, so they do wear on the outside of this joystick. They also seem to have a little bit more tension to them, whereas the ones on the Mantis are slightly soft, but they're still pretty decent. The caps on the SN30 Pro are also concave, they're extremely grippy, and there's a little bit of texture around the joystick as well. Next up, I think we should talk about this D-pad. It's pretty mushy, but it does have a good amount of resistance to it. Not a lot, but enough that you're actually going to feel when you push it. It is a rubber membrane D-pad, and it does completely bottom out in the center. You might get some false diagonals on retro games with this. It's not a bad D-pad. This is actually kind of the D-pads that I prefer. I just really like rubber membrane D-pads. Not for everyone, but I think it's pretty good. Looking really closely, there's a small amount of flare on the edges, but not by much. It's pretty quiet, so unfortunately I don't think I'm going to be able to get any audio samples from this. The controls in general are just pretty quiet. When you push this down, you can see how much this bottoms out. The joysticks stick out about 8.4 millimeters. So how heavy is the Mantis controller compared to some other devices and controllers that I own? Starting things off, the SN30 Pro comes in at 110.5 grams. The 8BitDo M30 comes out to 115.4 grams. The Mantis controller itself comes out to 177.5 grams. Comparing this to a full-size controller like the King Kong Pro 3, that one sits in at 245.6 grams. It's not a bad weight, and it does feel very comfortable when you're putting it in a bag to take it on the go. The closest handheld that I own to that same weight is probably the TrimUI Brick, at 161.7 grams. An unmodded Game Boy Advance SP with a game in it is also pretty close at about 160 grams. For perspective, this is ever so slightly heavier than an unmodded Game Boy Color with batteries in a game in it. Let's try hooking this up to a few different devices just to see how this works. I think we should check out this on an Android device first. I'm going to try this on my Retroid Pocket 5. This was pretty easy to pair. You have to hold the home button and the share button at the same time, just like with the PlayStation controller, but it does seem to work on Android. You can even access the home screen by pressing the home button. And every single button seems to work just fine. So let's try out a game and see how well it works. All the controls seem to automatically map in RetroArch, which is really nice. And it defaults to the D-pad for Sega Genesis, which is pretty nice. I'm not really noticing any latency. It's pretty good for Bluetooth. Let's try some Android games to see how well that works on there too. I do have a few games installed. Let's try Skull the Hero Slayer. This one does have some incompatibility issues with different modes from controllers, but I think this one should work okay in here. That's working absolutely fine on here. Another thing that I'm noticing is when it came up with the controller prompts, it is actually showing the PlayStation controller prompts, which is kind of cool. I guess since this is a PlayStation controller, Android does recognize it as such. But yeah, the controller works great on Android. As mentioned, the latency is not bad at all. As soon as I press that, he reacts nearly instantly. If this works with Android, what else does it work with? Let's try Switch. I also wanted to see if this works with the touchpad in Android, and yes, it does. This puts this controller in a pretty good position because this is the first controller that I've seen anyways that has a touchpad built into it. Obviously, the PlayStation controllers have that as well, but this is much cheaper than a PlayStation controller. I never thought that would work on Android, but I guess it does. So Android works. Let's try Switch next to see if that works. So I've got it loaded up on my Switch and I've gone to the controllers page. I'm not really sure how to pair this to the Switch, but I'm going to try pairing it exactly the same way as I did before. Now this isn't officially supported for Switch, so I'd be shocked if this works. I'm not getting anything on the Switch. Let's double check the manual to see if there's anything in that shows us how to hook it up. So there's a couple different ways to pair on this. So I was using the PlayStation 4 pairing method, but if you press the O in the home button, that's for Android. That should probably work. Try the Xbox mode too, which is the square in home. Let's try the Android pairing method. No, so that's not going to work for this. Let's try the PC pairing method, and that's the square in home button. This one might actually work because I know a lot of PC controllers that work on Switch. Like I said, not officially supported, but I mean, obviously I did want to try it anyways. Let's try PC. This is probably what I would use this controller for, is PC. I don't know if I would use it for the ROG Ally X per se, because this has some pretty comfortable grips on it. And it doesn't really have a stand, but the Legion Go though is something that I would use this with. If I took off the controllers on the Legion Go, kind of propped it up at lunch, and then pulled out this controller from my bag, I essentially have like a little mini laptop with a controller. I think this would be pretty fun to play. I could also hook up my Legion Go to a TV if I wanted, if I was out. So let's try this on PC and see how well it works. When I went to pair it, it showed up as an Xbox wireless controller, and it works right away. There's not a lot of latency either, especially on PC. It's pretty good. Not bad at all. Since my ROG Ally ran out of battery, let's just try this on the Legion Go. I've been playing Titanfall. This is one of the games I picked up on the Steam sale. It's a pretty fun game, and I had a lot of people recommend it to me. So it is cool that it is showing up as an Xbox controller. I'm not really noticing any input latency on PC either, which is really good. It's pretty instantaneous, maybe a little bit, but not bad. The rumble is really good too, actually. I kind of wonder if this is just my PC getting low FPS. Let me turn down the settings a little bit. I only have this set to 4 GB of VRAM in the BIOS. So that could have been something that was going on. Yeah, this is much more responsive now. Let's try out that trigger. This is with the analog mode. And it does seem pretty instantaneous. Let's switch it over to that hair trigger mode. There's a little bit less travel. Not the best hair triggers, but decent enough. And it's a cool feature to have. Can't believe how good the rumble is. I think it'll be really nice to actually have a PC controller now to take with me on the go. While this works pretty good on PC, I think we should take a look at some of the technical specifications and how fast this is polling. My guess is this is running at 125 Hz since it's running in Bluetooth mode, but we might as well check anyways. Let's go check that out. I use Gamepad LUT to test my controllers. Up at the top, there's downloads. We're going to check out the polling rate. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. And on the first one, there's one that's called polling. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you see what's going on. It's going to see 3 different controllers, 2 of the Legion Go controllers because 1 on each side, and then the Xbox One controller. This is the controller here. So we're going to put 1 in. Then it's going to ask us how many tests we want to do. I'm just going to go with the middle of the road and choose 4,000. We're going to test the left stick, which is 1. Then all I have to do is rotate the left joystick. Every time this pulls to the controller, it's going to give us one of these different results. So yeah, this is pulling exactly where I thought it was gonna. However, something that's interesting is that this is pulling with 97.95% stability. To put into perspective, 125 Hz is pretty standard for most controllers. Standard Xbox controllers are going to be 125 Hz. Of course, the Pro controllers are going to be a little quicker, but most Bluetooth controllers are also 125 Hz. Jitter is also really low, which is really good to see at only 3.1 milliseconds. But this is just incredible to see 97.95% stability. What this tells me is, yes, this is a Bluetooth controller, but it's a really good one. So let's test the circularity on these joysticks. I'm going to rotate these joysticks as far as I can go to the edge. This is going to populate this. Hall sensor joysticks should be pretty accurate at under 10%. So the right one gets 5.4%. That's pretty good. Let's check the left one. Now that is kind of interesting to see. It doesn't go all the way to the edge. You would have to probably calibrate these joysticks first to get this a little bit more accurate. The right joystick does seem pretty accurate, giving us 5.3 on the right joystick and 4.5 on the left joystick. That's pretty good. The best joysticks for circularity I see are on the Gully Kit controllers, but these are not too bad. I also want to test these triggers out, and as you can see, these do build a nice range of pressure. All in all, these are fantastic little controllers. I gotta admit, I really like the D-pad for these retro games. So unfortunately, I'm not able to get an overclock on this controller, but 125 Hz is pretty standard. The last test that I want to do is to see how well it works in my TomTalk bag. This is the Steam Deck one here. I'm going to put my ROG Ally in there because that's what I usually bring with me. That fits in there nicely. And I do have a little space here in the front, which would fit the controller. There's actually a lot of room in there for it. Let's check it out in the front pocket too. Unfortunately, the pocket kind of sticks out, so I probably wouldn't put it in there. If I was to bring this with me, I'd just put it down here in the front. That way it doesn't stick out in the front, and there's a lot of nice foam around it to protect it. But yeah, that fits really nice. Awesome little travel controller. So what are my final thoughts on the Mantis controller from Retro Fighters? I think it's a fantastic little controller. I like the triggers. The joysticks feel really comfortable. It's got a solid D-pad that feels very retro-like. The buttons are really good. I've had no connection issues with this controller so far. The transparent plastic actually looks really nice too. The only thing I don't like about this controller, I gotta say it, I kind of wish this had a 2.4 GHz wireless adapter with it. That would just make this way more versatile. We could have gotten better polling rates with this, but 125 Hz is good for most people. I like the little switch here at the bottom that allows us to swap between the different modes. And the last thing I don't really like, I'm not a big fan of these hair triggers. It doesn't really limit it much when you're using these trigger stops, and it kind of makes it a little clackety. It just sounds like plastic on plastic. Whereas the full analog trigger sounds much better. This is way softer and comparable to other controllers. With Retro Fighters, I haven't noticed any quality control issues. These are really solid controllers. So what do you think about the Mantis controller from Retro Fighters? Let me know in the comments below. Did you pick one of these up? And what do you use it for? As for me, I'll probably use this with my Windows handhelds when I'm taking them on the go. If you have any questions regarding the controller, make sure to ask in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.